The unsettled West, a complete history. Beyond the sunset. Close your eyes and picture the American West. What do you see? Perhaps it's a lone rider, silhouetted against a blood-red sunset in Monument Valley. A man with no name, defined by his quiet strength, his self-reliance, his six-shooter, and his freedom. You see dusty towns, swinging saloon doors, noble sheriffs, and black-hatted outlaws. You see cowboys and Indians, locked in a mythic struggle for a vast, empty continent. This is the West of legend, the West of the silver screen, the West that has become one of the defining tenets of American national identity. This story is simple, powerful, and deeply ingrained in our culture. It is also almost entirely a myth. The real American West was never empty. It was a continent of nations. It was the home of the Okithi-Sakowing, the people of the Seven Council Fires, whose lives were governed by the rhythm of the buffalo and the wisdom of the sacred hoop. It was the heart of the Comancheria, a formidable horse-powered empire that halted European expansion for over a century. It was a place of Spanish-speaking vaqueros who invented the cowboy trade, of Chinese laborers who blasted tunnels through the Sierra Nevada, of black exodusters who fled the oppression of the South to found towns on the Kansas prairie, and of women, Native, Mexican, and American, who built the communities that held this chaotic world together. The Wild West was not one story, but a million stories colliding on a landscape of breathtaking scale and unforgiving harshness. This is the story we are going to tell. This is the entire history of the American West, a journey that will take us from the ancient cultures that first called this land home, through the crucible of colonial encounters, to the bloody and transformative era of American expansion, and finally, to the birth of the powerful American myth that came to obscure it all. We will explore the forces that truly shaped this region, separating the hard, complicated history from the romantic, simple legend. To begin, we must understand the very concept of the frontier. It was never just a place on a map. For Americans, the frontier was a process, a direction, a state of mind. It was, as defined by the U.S. Census Bureau, a moving line, the margin of territory with a population density of fewer than 2 Euro-American people per square mile. It was the forward wave of American expansion, an advancing border that began with the first English settlements on the Atlantic coast in 1607 and was officially declared closed by the census of 1890. The historian Frederick Jackson Turner famously, and problematically, defined it as the meeting point between savagery and civilization. But for the people who already lived there, it was not a meeting point. It was an invasion. It was not a frontier. It was the center of the world. To understand the history of the West, we must first understand the world that existed before the West was ever a concept. Part 1. A world of nations, the West before the West. The first peoples. Long before the first European sails appeared on the horizon, the lands west of the Mississippi were a vibrant and complex tapestry of human societies. The story of this region does not begin in 1607 with Jamestown, or in 1492 with Columbus, but tens of thousands of years earlier. Paleo-Siberian peoples migrated from Asia across the Bering Strait Land Bridge, spreading across 2 continents and diversifying into thousands of distinct cultures. This was not a vacant wilderness waiting to be tamed. It was an inhabited homeland, a mosaic of nations with their own politics, economies, and deeply held spiritual beliefs. In the arid Southwest, the ancestors of the modern Pueblo peoples, the ancient Puebloans, built remarkable cities of stone and adobe, thriving in the region from around 1500 BC to 1000 AD. In the vast Great Basin, peoples like the Shoshone developed a way of life perfectly attuned to the scarce resources of their mountain environment. In the woodlands bordering the Mississippi River, other groups practiced agriculture, fished the rivers, and hunted in the dense forests. The very notion of the West or the frontier is an external one, a political construct imposed upon the region by outsiders moving in a single direction. For the people living there, this was not the West. It was simply their land, defined by its own sacred geography, its own borders, and its own ancient history. The arrival of Europeans did not introduce history to a timeless people. Rather, it violently interrupted and irrevocably altered histories that were already unfolding. The The continent was a dynamic place of shifting alliances, migrations, and conflicts long before the first colonists arrived. To understand the cataclysm that was to come, we must first appreciate the complexity of the world that was lost. We begin by looking closely at some of the most powerful and influential nations of the pre-colonial West. The Okithi-Sakowing, people of the Seven Council Fires. In the northern Great Plains, one of the most powerful and iconic groups that would come to define the struggle for the West was a great confederacy of peoples who called themselves the Okithi-Sakowing, meaning the people of the Seven Council Fires. The name referred to their political structure. A confederation of 7 distinct but related bands who would gather to kindle a collective fire from the coals of their individual camps, symbolizing their unity. These 7 original bands were the Mdewakanton, Wahpeton, Wapakut, Sisseton, Yankton, Yanktonai, and the Teton. To the outside world, and eventually to history, they would become known by a different name, the Sioux. This name was an exonym, a name given by outsiders. It was a French bastardization of an Ojibwe word, Nadueshix, which meant little snakes or, more broadly, enemies. Within the Okithi-Sakowing, however, they identified themselves by the dialect they spoke, the Dakota or Santee, Eastern, the Nakota or Yanktonai, Middle, and the Lakota or Teton, Western. The words Dakota and Lakota both translate to ally or friend in their respective dialects, a stark contrast to the name imposed upon them by their rivals and the Europeans who followed. Their social structure was built upon the bedrock of kinship. The fundamental unit was the Thaiwa or immediate family, which was part of a larger extended family network known as a Thiaspe. These Thiaspe or camp circles formed the basis of the village or oyate. This web of kinship was everything. It governed politics, economics, and spirituality. It even extended to outsiders, who could be adopted into the kinship society through the sacred Huankalo Wengpi ceremony or the making of relatives. Early European traders and missionaries who wished to have successful relations with the Okithi-Sakowing quickly learned that they had to form these social bonds, often through marriage, which created a kinship tie that regulated trade and conferred status. The original homeland of the Okithi-Sakowing was not the Great Plains, but the woodlands of the upper Mississippi Valley and the Great Lakes region, in what is now Minnesota and Wisconsin. Here, the Eastern Dakota bands lived a semi-sedentary life. They harvested wild rice, hunted woodland animals like deer and elk, and fished from canoes. Their westward migration onto the plains was a gradual process, driven by a combination of factors that began long before major European contact. A primary impetus was prolonged warfare with the well-armed Ojibwe to their east, who were themselves being pushed westward. This intertribal pressure, combined with the immense lure of the seemingly endless buffalo herds to the west, drew the Lakota and later the Nakota bands out onto the Great Plains. By 1776, a Lakota war party had reached the Black Hills, the sacred Paha Sapa, which would become the spiritual and geographical center of their new world. This new world was defined by 2 elements, the horse and the buffalo. The horse, which the Lakota acquired around 1770, revolutionized their society. They became master equestrians, and the horse transformed their methods of hunting, travel, and warfare. It became a measure of wealth and a symbol of status. The buffalo, or Tatanka, was the basis of their entire economy and spirituality. According to their beliefs, the buffalo came from inside the earth to give its life so the people could survive. Every part of the animal was used. It provided food, clothing from its hides, and shelter in the form of the iconic teepee, a dwelling perfectly suited to their new nomadic lifestyle. The daily life of the Okithi-Sakowing was inseparable from their spiritual beliefs. Their universe was created and unified by a single all-encompassing force known as Wakheng Thenka, the Great Spirit or Great Mystery. This interconnectedness of all things was visually represented by the Chengleska Wakheng, the sacred hoop or medicine wheel. Central to their worship was the Chinumpa, the sacred pipe, and the 7 sacred rites given to them by a supernatural figure, the white buffalo calf woman. She was an intermediary between Wakheng Thenka and humankind, and she taught them how to live as good relatives to each other and to the world through these ceremonies. These rites included the Inapi, purification in the sweat lodge, the Hengbal the Vision Quest, and the most important communal ceremony, the Wiwenjiang Wachapi, or Sun Dance. The Sun Dance was a profound ritual of sacrifice and renewal for the entire community and the earth itself, performed to ensure a healthy harvest, successful hunts, and the continued well-being of the people. Gender roles were complementary and highly valued. Men were responsible for hunting, protecting the village, and making war. Women were the masters of the domestic sphere. They raised the children, prepared food, and processed hides. Crucially, women owned the teepee and all the objects within it, giving them significant authority and status within the family. Artistry was also divided along gender lines. Men's art was often narrative, recording historical events, heroic deeds, and visionary experiences on buffalo robes and teepee liners. Women's art, particularly the intricate quillwork and later beadwork that adorned clothing and ceremonial objects, was more geometric and abstract. A woman's skill as an artist brought honor to her family and was a reflection of her good character and industry. This complex, deeply spiritual, and well-ordered society was the dominant power of the Northern Plains when the first waves of American expansion began to press westward. Hinumunu, rise of the Comanche Empire. Further south, another native nation rose to become a dominant force, an empire built on the back of the horse that controlled a vast swath of the southern plains for over 150 years. They called themselves the Numunu, meaning the people. The Spanish and later the Americans would call them the Comanche. Like the Lakota, the Comanche were not originally a plains people. Anthropological and linguistic evidence shows they were a branch of the northern Shoshone, hunter-gatherers who lived a pedestrian life in the mountains of the Great Basin, in what is now Wyoming and Idaho. Their destiny was forever changed sometime before 1700, when they acquired the horse. This single technological acquisition triggered one of the most dramatic social and military transformations in North American history. Within a few generations, the Comanche remade themselves from crudely equipped mountain wanderers into the most formidable light cavalry the continent had ever seen. They were, as many have said, the first and greatest of the plains horse cultures. Their newfound mobility allowed them to sweep down from the mountains onto the Great Plains, drawn south by several powerful incentives. The vast, seemingly limitless herds of buffalo, a warmer climate, and, most importantly, proximity to the source of their power, the immense herds of wild mustangs in the southwest. This southern migration also brought them into contact with French traders operating out of Louisiana, giving them access to another crucial technology: firearms. This unique geopolitical position, able to raid the Spanish for horses and trade with the French for guns, was a key factor in their meteoric rise. They created a barrier that halted Spanish colonial expansion northward from Mexico and French expansion westward from Louisiana for decades. The heart of their domain was known as the Comancheria, a territory that stretched across modern-day western Texas, western Oklahoma, eastern New Mexico, and southeastern Colorado. This was not an empire in the European sense, with cities, a centralized bureaucracy, and a single monarch. It was a fluid, decentralized empire of power and influence. They dominated the region through military prowess, controlled trade networks, and exploited the resources of the plains, subjugating or driving out all rivals, including the famously fierce Apache, who they pushed out of the southern plains. The Comanche economy was a triad of hunting, raiding, and trading, all revolving around the horse and the buffalo. They were masters of breeding and training horses, and their herds were a measure of wealth and a primary trade commodity. They hunted the buffalo with an efficiency unimaginable to their pedestrian ancestors, and the products of the hunt, hides, meat, and robes were bartered with agricultural tribes like the Pueblo to the west and the Wichita to the east, in exchange for corn, beans, and squash. Their most valuable and feared trade good, however, was captives, taken in raids that reached as far south as central Mexico, who were then sold or ransomed. Comanche society was fiercely democratic and individualistic. They were organized not into a single tribe, but into numerous autonomous bands, often based on kinship ties. Major bands included the Penatica, honey eaters, the Nakoni, those who turned back, and the powerful Quahati, antelopes, who roamed the high plains of the Llano Estacado and were the last to surrender to the Americans. Each band had peace chiefs and war chiefs, but leaders held their position only through demonstrated ability, wisdom, and the consent of their followers. No chief could compel an individual warrior to follow a decision made by a council. This profound emphasis on individual freedom was a source of great strength and resilience, but it also made them incredibly difficult for European and American powers to deal with. A treaty signed with one Comanche band meant nothing to another, a fact that would lead to endless cycles of misunderstanding and conflict in the century to come. For nearly 2 centuries, the Lords of the Plains were the dominant power in the Southwest, a testament to their remarkable ability to adapt and innovate in a rapidly changing world. The Apache and Cheyenne worlds in motion. The vastness of the West was home to countless other nations, each with a unique history of adaptation and change. Among them, the Apache and the Cheyenne offer compelling case studies of different paths taken in the face of mounting pressure. The people known as the Apache, who call themselves NDE or the People, were not a single unified tribe but a collection of related Athabascan-speaking groups who occupied a huge territory in the Southwest, from Arizona to Texas and deep into Mexico. Their social organization was exquisitely adapted to their harsh desert and mountain environment. The fundamental social unit was the extended family, organized along matrilineal and matrilocal lines. This means that descent and identity were traced through the mother's line, and when a man married, he joined his wife's family group, or Gota. These family clusters were the anchors of society, providing the cooperative labor needed for survival. Women held high status as the core of these enduring family units. Several family groups formed a local group, which controlled a specific territory, and these local groups were led by a headman chosen for his wisdom and prestige. Among some, like the Western Apache, these groups were further linked by a system of over 50 named exogamous matrilineal clans. These clans, which a person belonged to through their mother, created a web of kinship that transcended local territories, regulating marriage and providing a network for support and cooperation across the vast Apache lands. Their economy was a flexible mix of hunting, gathering wild plants like agave, and small-scale horticulture, with men and women sharing the labor in a practical, adaptable system. The Cheyenne, who call themselves Tsisistas, meaning the people or the beautiful people, followed a very different trajectory, one of dramatic migration and cultural reinvention. Before 1700, they were an agricultural people living in settled villages of earth lodges in what is now Minnesota, where they farmed corn, gathered wild rice, and made pottery. Pushed westward by pressure from the Ojibwe, they moved to the Cheyenne River in North Dakota. It was here that they likely acquired the horse, a moment that would pivot their entire culture. Further pressure, this time from the Lakota, pushed them out of their villages and fully onto the Great Plains. They abandoned agriculture and pottery, transforming themselves into nomadic, teepee-dwelling buffalo hunters, the archetypal Plains Indians of popular imagination. Their society was organized into 10 major bands, which were governed by a revered council of 44 chiefs, a body of leaders who made decisions for the entire nation. Alongside this civil authority were 7 powerful military societies, such as the famous dog soldiers, Haudenosaunee, who acted as camp police and were ferocious warriors in battle. Cheyenne's spiritual life was centered on 2 principal deities and was guided by visions. Their most sacred tribal objects, which embodied their collective identity and power, were the Mahats, the 4 sacred arrows, and the Isiwin, the sacred buffalo hat. These objects were central to their ceremonies and were carried into battle to ensure victory. By the 1830s, the Cheyenne had split into 2 major groups, the Northern Cheyenne in the Platte River region and the Southern Cheyenne along the Arkansas River, a division that would shape their interactions with the encroaching Americans. The stories of the Okeechee-Sakowing, the Comanche, the Apache, and the Cheyenne are just a few threads in a much larger tapestry. They reveal a continent that was anything but static or empty. It was a human world, defined by complex societies, sophisticated spiritualities, and dynamic histories of migration, conflict, and adaptation. It was this world that was about to be thrust into a colonial crucible, a collision of cultures that would transform the continent forever. Part 2: The Colonial Crucible. The world of the Native West did not exist in isolation. Beginning in the 16th century, it was drawn into the orbit of competing European empires, each with its own agenda, its own methods, and its own devastating impact. This was not a simple story of one culture meeting another. It was a violent and transformative collision of three worlds, native, Spanish, and French, that forged a new, more interconnected, and far more dangerous West. The most powerful forces of change unleashed in this era were not armies or laws, but two biological agents that would remake the continent: microscopic pathogens and the horse, the Spanish sword and cross. The Spanish were the first Europeans to make a significant impact on the American West, pushing north from their established empire in Mexico. Their colonial project was driven by a powerful duality: the sword and the cross. They sought wealth, primarily gold and silver, and they sought to save souls by converting native peoples to Catholicism. This dual agenda profoundly, and often brutally, reshaped the societies of the Southwest. The first major Spanish foray into the region was the expedition of Francisco Vázquez de Coronado in 1540. Lured by tales of the mythical seven cities of gold, Coronado and his army marched through what is now Arizona, New Mexico, and Kansas, finding no gold but leaving a trail of violence and being the first to document the vastness of the region and its peoples. Permanent Spanish colonization began in 1598, when Juan de Oñate established the province of Nuevo Mexico, with its capital later founded at Santa Fe in 1610. The Spanish colonial model was one of direct subjugation. Through the encomienda system, Spanish colonists were granted the right to demand tribute and forced labor from native communities. Native people were put to work in silver mines and on Spanish ranches under brutal conditions. Simultaneously, Franciscan friars established a network of missions, working to systematically eradicate traditional native religions, which they viewed as pagan idolatry. They banned sacred dances, destroyed kivas and other religious objects, and focused on converting the young, driving a wedge between generations and eroding cultural knowledge. For 80 years, the Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande Valley endured this economic exploitation and religious persecution. A prolonged drought in the 1670s, which made it impossible to meet Spanish demands for corn tribute, combined with increasing raids from rival tribes like the Apache, pushed tensions to a breaking point. The Pueblo people attributed their suffering to the Spanish presence, which had disrupted the spiritual balance of their world. In 1680, this simmering resentment exploded in a coordinated, brilliant revolt. The Pueblo Uprising, or Popes Rebellion, was meticulously planned by a Tewa religious leader named Pope, who had been publicly flogged by the Spanish for practicing his traditional religion. Uniting numerous, often rivalrous Pueblo towns, the warriors launched a surprise attack on August 10, 1680. They killed over 400 Spanish colonists and soldiers, destroyed mission churches, and laid siege to Santa Fe, eventually forcing the remaining 2,000 Spaniards to flee south to El Paso in a humiliating retreat. The Pueblo Revolt was the single most successful native uprising against a colonial power in North American history. For 12 years, the Pueblo peoples lived free of Spanish rule, restoring their traditional religious practices and governments. However, internal divisions, continued drought, and persistent raids from other tribes weakened their coalition. In 1692, the Spanish returned under Diego de Vargas and reconquered New Mexico. Yet, the revolt had permanent consequences. The Spanish, having learned a brutal lesson, were never again as oppressive in their demands. The encomienda system was not reimposed with the same harshness, and the Franciscans were forced to tolerate a degree of religious syncretism, where Pueblo peoples blended their own ancient practices with the rituals of Catholicism, a cultural fusion that persists to this day. Perhaps the most significant unintended consequence of the revolt was the liberation of thousands of Spanish horses. These animals spread rapidly northward through native trade networks, accelerating the rise of the great horse cultures of the plains and forever changing the balance of power on the continent. The French fur trade, a network of dependence. While the Spanish sought to conquer and convert, the French pursued a different colonial model in the northern part of the continent, from the Great Lakes to the upper Mississippi Valley. The French Empire in North America was built not on gold or agriculture, but on fur, primarily the beaver pelt, which was in high demand in Europe for making felt hats. This economic focus created a relationship with native nations that was less about direct subjugation and more about commercial partnership and mutual dependence, a relationship that was nonetheless transformative and, in many ways, just as destructive as the Spanish system. The French understood that they could not harvest the furs themselves. They lacked the skills, the numbers, and the knowledge of the vast and difficult terrain. Their success depended entirely on forming alliances with native nations like the Huron, Algonquin, and later the Ojibwe and Cree, who were master trappers and hunters. In exchange for furs, the French provided a steady supply of European-manufactured goods: metal pots, wool blankets, knives, and, most desired of all, firearms. This trade created a profound economic interdependence. For native peoples, these goods were not just novelties. They became cultural and material necessities. A steel knife was far more durable than a flint one. An iron kettle was more efficient than pottery or baskets for cooking, and a musket offered a significant advantage in both hunting and warfare. This reliance gradually led to a shift in native economies, away from subsistence hunting and gathering and toward commercial trapping for a global market. Traditional skills for making tools began to erode as people came to depend on trade goods. To facilitate this trade, French traders, known as coureurs de bois, runners of the woods, and later voyagers, lived among native communities. Unlike the Spanish, they did not try to impose their own social structures. Instead, they adapted to native customs. They learned native languages, participated in gift-giving ceremonies, and, most importantly, intermarried with native women. These marriages were not just personal arrangements. They were the bedrock of the trade, creating the kinship ties that were the basis of trust and alliance in native societies. Over generations, this intermingling created a unique new people, the Métis, who blended French and native cultures and played a crucial role as intermediaries in the fur trade. This relationship, while often egalitarian on a personal level, had devastating long-term consequences. The introduction of firearms dramatically intensified warfare between tribes. As groups like the Iroquois and Ojibwe gained access to guns, they used their new military power to expand their hunting territories and control access to French traders, pushing other groups like the Lakota westward. The competition for furs created new conflicts and shattered old alliances. The French also introduced alcohol, which was often used unscrupulously by traders to cheat native partners, and which had a devastating social impact on communities. Furthermore, the French demand for furs led to the overhunting of beaver and other animals, depleting resources and disrupting local ecosystems. Finally, the French demand for native slaves, though different in character from the chattel slavery of the American South, drove an unprecedented increase in slave raiding among tribes, adding another layer of chaos and violence to the region. The French model, built on partnership, ultimately entangled native nations in a web of economic dependency and escalating violence that left them vulnerable to the next wave of colonial power. The Great Dying and the Four-Legged Revolution. Beyond the sword, the cross, and the beaver pelt, the most profound and far-reaching agents of change brought by Europeans were biological. One was a microscopic invader that caused the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. The other was a four-legged animal that revolutionized life on the Great Plains. Native American peoples had been isolated from the populations of the Old World for millennia. This isolation meant they had no acquired immunity to the host of diseases that had co-evolved with humans and domesticated animals in Europe, Asia, and Africa. When Europeans arrived, they unknowingly brought these diseases with them. The results were apocalyptic. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, bubonic plague, cholera, and even the common cold swept through native communities with terrifying speed and lethality. These were virgin soil epidemics, striking populations with no previous exposure and no immunological defenses. Mortality rates were staggering, often claiming 30%, 50%, or in some cases over 90% of a village's population. The diseases spread far faster than the Europeans themselves, passed along native trade routes from one community to another. A major smallpox epidemic, for example, is documented to have ravaged the tribes of the Pacific Northwest in the 1780s, a full decade before the first American ships reached the Columbia River. When Lewis and Clark passed through the area in 1805, They found villages depopulated and heard stories of a devastating spotted disease that had killed nearly everyone. This Great Dying was not a single event but a series of recurring waves of pestilence that continued throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. The impact of this demographic collapse cannot be overstated. It shattered social structures, destroyed families, and erased generations of accumulated knowledge and tradition. It wiped out political and religious leaders, creating power vacuums and social chaos. And critically, it catastrophically weakened the ability of native nations to resist the physical encroachment of European and American settlers who would follow. The second biological revolution was the reintroduction of the horse to the Americas. Horses had been native to the continent in the prehistoric era but had gone extinct. The Spanish brought them back, and from their colonial outposts in the southwest, the horse spread northward with incredible speed, passed from tribe to tribe through raiding and trading. By the early 1700s, horses had reached the northern plains. The horse utterly transformed the lives of the peoples who adopted it. Before the horse, plains peoples used dogs to pull small sleds called travois. A horse could pull a much larger load, allowing people to transport larger teepees and more possessions, increasing their mobility and comfort. More importantly, the horse revolutionized hunting. A mounted hunter could easily keep pace with a buffalo herd, making the hunt far more efficient and less dangerous than it had been on foot. This allowed plains tribes to harvest a surplus of meat and hides, leading to an era of unprecedented prosperity and population growth for groups like the Lakota and Comanche. The horse also transformed warfare. It made warriors swift and deadly, allowing for lightning-fast raids and expanded territories. The horse itself became a primary target of these raids and a new, potent measure of wealth and prestige. A man's status was often measured by the size of his horse herd. This new dynamic shifted old tribal alliances and created new conflicts, as horse-rich tribes dominated their pedestrian neighbors and horse-poor tribes raided to build their own herds. The horse, like the European diseases, was an unintentional introduction that completely remade the human landscape of the American West, setting the stage for the final, most intense chapter of its history, the arrival of the United States. Part 3. An Empire for Liberty, the American Advance. As the 18th century gave way to the 19th, a new power emerged, poised to dominate the continent. The young United States, having secured its independence from Britain, began to look westward not just for trade or souls, but for land for a rapidly growing population of farmers and land for the expansion of the nation itself. This American advance was driven by a unique and powerful combination of strategic calculation, land hunger, and a quasi-religious ideology of national destiny. Through a series of decisive actions, a stunning land purchase, a continental exploration, a mass migration, a provoked war, and a revolutionary land policy, the United States systematically acquired the West, transforming it from a zone of competing colonial interests into a target for national settlement and forever altering the fate of all who lived there. Jefferson's Gamble, the Louisiana Purchase, and the core of discovery. The single most pivotal event in the history of American westward expansion occurred not on a battlefield or a frontier trail, but in the diplomatic chambers of Paris in 1803. The Louisiana Purchase was a geopolitical gamble of breathtaking scale, an unplanned and unexpected opportunity that President Thomas Jefferson seized to secure the future of his Empire for Liberty. The crisis began in 1802. For years, American farmers west of the Appalachian Mountains had depended on the Mississippi River to ship their goods to market through the Spanish-controlled port of New Orleans. When Spain, in a secret treaty, transferred the vast Louisiana territory back to Napoleonic France and subsequently revoked the American right of deposit in New Orleans, it created an existential threat to the young republic. Western settlers spoke of secession, and opposition Federalists called for war. Jefferson, a proponent of agrarian democracy, knew that access to the Mississippi was non-negotiable. He wrote that France's possession of Louisiana was the embryo of a tornado which will burst on the countries on both shores of the Atlantic. Jefferson dispatched James Monroe to Paris to join Minister Robert Livingston. Their instructions were modest: to purchase New Orleans and the coastal region of West Florida for up to $10 million. But they arrived at a fortuitous moment. Napoleon's grand plans for a new world empire were collapsing. His army in the sugar-rich colony of Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, had been decimated by a slave rebellion and yellow fever. A new war with Britain loomed, and he knew that Louisiana, without the wealth of Haiti to support it, would be impossible to defend from a British invasion from Canada. Needing cash for his European wars, Napoleon's finance minister made a stunning counteroffer. Not just New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana territory. Seizing on what Jefferson called a fugitive occurrence, Monroe and Livingston exceeded their authority and on April 30, 1803, agreed to purchase approximately 827,000 square miles of land for $15 million, about 3 cents an acre. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States overnight, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. Jefferson himself harbored constitutional doubts about whether the president had the authority to acquire new territory, but he rationalized it as a guardian acting for the good of his ward, and the Senate swiftly ratified the treaty. Even before the purchase was finalized, Jefferson, a man of the Enlightenment with an insatiable scientific curiosity, had already set in motion a plan to explore this vast unknown. He commissioned his personal secretary, Captain Meriwether Lewis, to lead an expedition through the newly acquired lands and beyond to the Pacific Ocean. Lewis chose his friend and former Army colleague, Lieutenant William Clark, to be his co-commander. The mission of the Corps of Discovery, which set out from St. Charles, Missouri on May 14, 1804, was multifaceted. Its primary geopolitical goal was to find the fabled Northwest Passage, an all-water route across the continent that would facilitate commerce. Diplomatically, they were to establish peaceful relations and trade with the dozens of native nations they would encounter. Scientifically, they were to act as a mobile research team, meticulously documenting the geography, climate, soil, and the flora and fauna of the region. Over the next 2.5 years, the expedition journeyed nearly 8,000 miles to the Pacific and back. They failed to find an all-water route, discovering instead the formidable barrier of the Rocky Mountains. But in every other respect, the expedition was a monumental success. Clark's maps provided the first accurate picture of the geography of the West, a picture that would guide settlers for the next 40 years. Lewis, a trained naturalist, identified 178 plants and 122 animals new to American science, including the grizzly bear, the prairie dog, and the pronghorn antelope. Their journey would have been impossible without the aid of the native peoples they met. Tribes provided them with food, shelter, and crucial geographic knowledge. Most famously, they were joined by a young Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, who, along with her French-Canadian husband Toussaint Charbonneau, served as an interpreter. Her presence was invaluable, not only for her language skills but because a war party would not travel with a woman and child, signaling the Corps' peaceful intentions. When the expedition reached the Rockies, her connection to her brother, a Shoshone chief, was instrumental in securing the horses they desperately needed to cross the mountains. The Lewis and Clark expedition was a profound statement of American intent. It established a U.S. presence in the Pacific Northwest, strengthening American claims to the Oregon country against those of Britain. It opened the door for a wave of American fur trappers and traders who would follow in their footsteps, and it fired the national imagination with its reports of a vast continent of immense resources and potential. Jefferson's gamble had not only doubled the nation's size, it had provided the map and the motive for a century of expansion that would follow. Manifest Destiny's Trail, the pioneers. The Louisiana Purchase provided the territory, and the Lewis and Clark expedition provided the knowledge, but it was a powerful, quasi-religious ideology that provided the moral and spiritual justification for the great wave of migration that followed. This ideology was manifest destiny. The phrase was coined in 1845 by a journalist named John L. O'Sullivan, who wrote that it was America's manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. The idea itself, however, was much older, rooted in the Puritan concept of a shining city upon a hill and the conviction of American exceptionalism. Manifest destiny fused 3 core tenets: the belief in the unique virtue of the American people and their democratic institutions, the belief in a mission to redeem and remake the world in the American image, and the belief in a divinely ordained destiny to accomplish this mission. It framed continental expansion not as an act of conquest, but as a benevolent, inevitable, and righteous process of spreading liberty and civilization across a supposedly virgin wilderness. This ideology conveniently ignored the native peoples who already inhabited the land, casting them as savages to be overcome, and it was used by Democrats to justify the annexation of Texas and the war with Mexico. The most iconic physical expression of manifest destiny was the Oregon Trail, a 2,000-mile overland route that snaked from Independence, Missouri, to the fertile Willamette Valley in Oregon. Between the early 1840s and the 1880s, an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 pioneers made this epic journey, forever changing the American West. The motivations for undertaking such a perilous trek were varied. In the East, the country was rocked by economic depression and outbreaks of disease, spurring many to seek a fresh start. Missionaries like Marcus and Narcissa Whitman wrote glowing letters back east, extolling the virtues of Oregon and its potential for converting Native Americans to Christianity. The greatest lure, however, was the promise of land. The Provisional Government of Oregon, and later the U.S. government with the Oregon Donation Land Act of 1850, offered vast tracts of land, up to 640 acres, to settlers, an unimaginable opportunity for the landless and poor in the East. This migration was also a geopolitical tool, encouraged by politicians who knew that a growing American population in the Oregon country would solidify U.S. claims to the territory against those of Great Britain. The journey itself was a 5 to 6 month ordeal of immense hardship. Pioneers had to outfit their prairie schooners with hundreds of pounds of supplies and travel in large wagon trains for protection. Life on the trail was a monotonous grind, punctuated by moments of terror. The greatest killer was not conflict with Native Americans, as myth would have it, but disease. Cholera, dysentery, and smallpox swept through the wagon trains, which were essentially moving cities with no sanitation. Accidents were common. Children falling under wagon wheels, accidental gunshots, and drownings during treacherous river crossings. Starvation was a constant threat, as was the brutal weather, from scorching summer heat on the plains to freezing snows in the mountains. The trail was a graveyard. It is estimated that nearly 1 in 10 who started the journey did not survive. A significant and distinct chapter of this westward migration was the Mormon Exodus. Fleeing intense religious persecution in the East, followers of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, led by Brigham Young, began their own organized trek westward in 1846. They sought a remote sanctuary where they could build their own society free from interference. They found it in the desolate Great Salt Lake Valley, in what is now Utah. Through remarkable organization, discipline, and sophisticated irrigation techniques, they made the desert bloom and established a thriving, theocratic society that would become a powerful force in the Intermountain West. The pioneer trails carved the paths for American settlement, turning the abstract idea of manifest destiny into a demographic reality on the ground. Each wagon that reached Oregon or Utah was a nail in the coffin of British and Mexican claims and a step toward the dispossession of the region's native peoples. The color of gold. The California Gold Rush, 1848 to 1855. If the Oregon Trail represented the slow, grinding advance of agrarian settlement, the California Gold Rush was a sudden, explosive, and global phenomenon that radically accelerated the transformation of the West. It unleashed the largest migration in American history, created staggering wealth, and turned a sparsely populated territory into a state almost overnight, all while inflicting catastrophic violence on native peoples and the environment. On January 24, 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall discovered flakes of gold at a sawmill he was building for John Sutter on the American River in Northern California. The timing was extraordinary. Just 9 days later, on February 2, 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, formally ending the Mexican-American War and ceding California to the United States. Neither side knew that the land being transferred contained riches beyond imagination. News of the discovery at first spread slowly, met with skepticism. But when a San Francisco entrepreneur named Sam Brannan marched through the streets waving a vial of gold dust, the rush began. The city's male population emptied out and headed for the gold fields. Word then spread by sea. Before most of the East Coast even knew what was happening, thousands of prospectors from Oregon, Hawaii, Mexico, Chile, Peru, and China were already on their way to California in the summer and fall of 1848. The news finally reached the rest of the nation in December 1848, when President James K. Polk confirmed the discovery in a message to Congress. The result was pandemonium. In 1849, the 49ers came in a flood. They came overland on the California Trail, a brutal journey that mirrored the hardships of the Oregon route. They came by sea, enduring months-long voyages around Cape Horn. And they came by a combination route across the Isthmus of Panama. In a society increasingly defined by wage labor, the idea that an ordinary person could achieve immense wealth simply by picking it up off the ground proved irresistible. California's non-native population exploded, from around 14,000 in 1848 to over 220,000 by 1852. San Francisco transformed from a sleepy port of a few hundred people into a chaotic, bustling metropolis of 36,000. The economic impact was staggering. The influx of gold $81 million worth in the peak year of 1852 alone reinvigorated the entire U.S. economy. New industries sprang up to service the miners, from banking and shipping to manufacturing and agriculture. Iconic American companies like Wells Fargo, providing secure transport for gold, and Levi Strauss, providing durable canvas pants for miners, were born from the boom. This rapid population and economic growth allowed California to bypass the normal territorial stage. In 1850, as part of a complex national compromise over slavery, California was admitted to the Union as a free state, a move that dangerously upset the delicate balance of power between North and South. But this story of progress and prosperity had a profoundly dark side. For the native peoples of California, the gold rush was nothing short of a genocide. The miners, operating with impunity, drove them from their lands, stole their resources, and murdered them with breathtaking brutality. An estimated 120,000 Native Americans died from disease, starvation, and homicide during the gold rush years. The state government even subsidized vigilante militias to hunt and kill Indians. The multi-ethnic nature of the gold rush also bred intense racial conflict. As the easily accessible surface gold disappeared, competition grew fierce. Anglo-American miners, steeped in the ideology of manifest destiny, became increasingly territorial, believing the gold was meant for them alone. They used violence and discriminatory laws, such as the foreign miners' tax, to drive out competition, particularly from Mexican, Chilean, and Chinese miners. The environmental devastation was equally immense. Early panning and sluicing gave way to industrial-scale hydraulic mining, where powerful water cannons blasted away entire hillsides to get at the gold-bearing gravel. This process choked rivers with tons of sediment, destroying fish populations, causing massive downstream flooding that ruined agricultural lands, and poisoning the water with mercury used in the extraction process. The gold rush compressed a century of change into a single decade. It created a dynamic, wealthy, and diverse new state, but it did so at a terrible human and environmental cost, revealing the violent, extractive, and racially charged underbelly of the manifest destiny dream. War with Mexico, 1846 to 1848. The acquisition of the American Southwest was not accomplished through purchase or settlement, but through conquest. The Mexican-American War was the bloody, physical culmination of manifest destiny, an offensive war deliberately provoked by the United States to seize vast territories from its southern neighbor. The roots of the conflict lay in the 1836 Texas Revolution and the subsequent annexation of the Republic of Texas by the United States in 1845. The Mexican government had never recognized Texan independence and considered the annexation an act of aggression. The immediate trigger for war was a border dispute. The U.S. claimed the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas, while Mexico insisted it was the Nueces River, further to the north. The land between the two rivers, the Nueces Strip, was a sparsely populated and contested territory. President James K. Polk, a fervent expansionist who had won the presidency on a platform of acquiring both Oregon and California, saw this dispute as his opportunity. In early 1846, he ordered General Zachary Taylor and his troops into the disputed territory, a clear provocation. As one U.S. officer wrote in his diary, We have not one particle of right to be here. It looks as if the government sent a small force on purpose to bring on a war, so as to have a pretext for taking California and as much of this country as it chooses. On April 25, 1846, a Mexican cavalry unit crossed the Rio Grande and ambushed an American patrol, killing 11 soldiers. Polk now had his pretext. He went before Congress and declared that Mexico had passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory and shed American blood upon the American soil. The war was deeply controversial. In the North, many Whigs and abolitionists, including a young Illinois congressman named Abraham Lincoln and the writer Henry David Thoreau, denounced it as an unjust war of aggression designed to expand the territory of slavery. Despite this opposition, Congress declared war on May 13, 1846. The war itself was a decisive, if brutal, victory for the United States. American forces, better equipped and led, won a series of battles in northern Mexico under General Taylor and launched a brilliant amphibious invasion under General Winfield Scott that culminated in the capture of Mexico City in September 1847. Meanwhile, another American force under General Stephen Kearny occupied New Mexico, and American settlers in California, in the Bear Flag Revolt, declared their independence from Mexico. The war was marked by significant violence against Mexican civilians, fueled by racist attitudes that saw Mexicans as racial inferiors. The war officially ended with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on February 2, 1848. The terms were a stunning victory for the United States and a devastating loss for Mexico. Mexico was forced to cede more than 525,000 square miles of its territory, what became the states of California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, most of Arizona and Colorado, and parts of Wyoming and Kansas, in exchange for a payment of $15 million. This vast acquisition, known as the Mexican Cession, fulfilled the continental vision of Manifest Destiny. The consequences were profound. The war solidified the American belief in its divine mission to expand. It provided a crucial training ground for a generation of officers, including Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, and Stonewall Jackson, who would soon face each other in the Civil War. Most significantly, the acquisition of this immense new territory poured gasoline on the smoldering fire of the slavery debate. The question of whether these new lands would be free or slave would dominate American politics for the next decade, shattering political compromises and pushing the nation inexorably toward disunion and civil war. The Homesteader's Promise. The Homestead Act of 1862. While war and gold rushes dramatically reshaped the far west, the settlement of the vast interior of the continent, the Great Plains, was driven by a landmark piece of legislation. The Homestead Act of 1862. Signed into law by President Abraham Lincoln during the heart of the Civil War, the act was a revolutionary concept in land distribution, promising to turn the public domain into a landscape of independent family farms. It accelerated the settlement of the plains, but its democratic promise was often undermined by the harsh realities of the environment and widespread fraud. For decades, Southern Democrats had blocked homestead legislation, fearing it would fill new territories with small, independent farmers who would oppose the expansion of slavery. With the secession of the Southern states, the new Republican-controlled Congress was free to act. The Homestead Act provided that any adult citizen or intended citizen who had never borne arms against the United States could claim 160 acres of surveyed government land. This offer was open to men, single women, and, crucially, to formerly enslaved people, making it one of the most egalitarian land laws in history. To gain title to the land, a claimant had to pay a small filing fee, live on the plot for 5 continuous years, and make improvements by building a home and cultivating the land. The act unleashed a new wave of migration onto the Great Plains. Over its 123-year history, the Homestead Act was responsible for the settlement of 270 million acres, roughly 10% of the total area of the United States. It embodied the Jeffersonian ideal of a nation of yeoman farmers and seemed to offer a path out of poverty for the urban poor and landless farmers of the East. However, the reality of homesteading was far more difficult than the promise. The act was framed with the well-watered lands of the East in mind. On the arid and semi-arid plains, a 160-acre plot was often simply not large enough to sustain a family through farming. The environment itself was a formidable adversary. Homesteaders faced relentless wind, scorching summers, brutal blizzards, and plagues of insects like grasshoppers that could devour a year's crop in a day. The treeless plains meant there was no lumber for building homes, forcing many settlers to construct their first houses out of sod, which were notoriously damp, dirty, and prone to leaking. Furthermore, the act was not the panacea for poverty it was intended to be. While the land was nearly free, the costs of transportation, building a home, and acquiring the necessary tools, seed, and livestock were prohibitive for the truly poor. The act was also plagued by fraud. Its ambiguous language was exploited by speculators, cattle companies, mining interests, and railroads, who used dummy filers and other illegal means to acquire vast tracts of the best land and water sources. In the end, of the 500 million acres of public land dispersed by the government between 1862 and 1904, only 80 million acres went to actual homesteaders. Most importantly, the entire premise of the Homestead Act rested on a fiction, that the Great Plains were public land, empty and available for the taking. This completely ignored the pre-existing land rights and treaties of the Native American nations who had lived there for centuries. The act became a primary legal instrument for the dispossession of Native peoples. Each homestead claim filed was another piece of tribal land carved away, another step in the process of confining Native Americans to ever-shrinking reservations. The Homestead Act, therefore, represents the central paradox of westward expansion. It was an engine of democratic opportunity for some, built directly upon the foundation of dispossession and conquest for others. Part 4. The High Lonesome Life and Legend in the Wild West, circa 1865 to 1890. The period following the American Civil War, from roughly 1865 to 1890, is the era that pop culture has immortalized as the Wild West. This was the age of the great cattle drives, the iconic cowboy, the notorious gunfighters, and the rapid settlement of the last open spaces. It was a time of immense economic transformation, cultural collision, and violence. Yet the reality of this period was far more complex, diverse, and interesting than the legends it spawned. The archetypes of the West, the cowboy, the gunfighter, the pioneer, were not simple figures of myth, but real people shaped by a confluence of economic forces, cultural traditions, and the harsh realities of a land undergoing radical change. The Cattle Kingdom, from the vaquero to the American cowboy. The most enduring symbol of the American West is the cowboy. The image of a rugged, independent horseman driving cattle across the vast plains is central to the Western myth. But this iconic American figure was not an American invention. The entire culture and industry of open-range cattle ranching was a direct inheritance from the Spanish and Mexican vaquero. The vaquero tradition has its roots in the hacienda system of medieval Spain and was brought to the Americas in the 16th century. In the arid lands of what would become Mexico and the American Southwest, Spanish ranchers raised vast herds of cattle. To manage these herds on horseback, they developed a unique set of skills, tools, and a specialized vocabulary. These were the original cowboys. They were expert horsemen and masters of the rope, or la riata. They developed the horn stock saddle, the use of lassos, lazo, and protective leather leggings called chaparreras to guard against the thorny chaparral brush. The very words of the American cowboy are echoes of the Spanish. Vaquero, buckaroo, is an anglicization of vaquero. Lariat comes from la riata, chaps from chaparreras, and ranch from rancho. The American cattle industry exploded after the Civil War. During the war, millions of longhorn cattle in Texas had been left to roam and multiply, becoming virtually wild. In Texas, a longhorn was worth only a few dollars a head, but in the industrial cities of the North and East, where beef was in high demand, the same animal could fetch 10 times that amount. This massive price differential created the economic engine for the great cattle drives. To move these millions of cattle from Texas to the nearest railheads in Kansas, a new workforce was needed. Young men, many of them former Confederate soldiers, newly freed African Americans, and Mexicans, flocked to Texas to work as cowboys. They learned their trade by adopting the tools and techniques perfected by the vaqueros over centuries. Contrary to the cinematic image of the exclusively white cowboy, this workforce was one of the most racially diverse in 19th century America. Historians estimate that as many as 1 in 4 cowboys on the trail was African American. For black men fleeing the oppressive racial hierarchy of the post-Reconstruction South, the life of a cowboy offered a rare degree of autonomy and economic opportunity. While racism certainly existed on the trail, the demands of the work created a pragmatic interdependence where a man's skill with a horse and rope often mattered more than the color of his skin. Black, white, and Hispanic cowboys worked, ate, and slept together under the same sky, a level of integration almost unheard of in other parts of the country at the time. The American cowboy, therefore, is not a symbol of pure Anglo-Saxon individualism, but a testament to the West's true nature as a place of profound cultural mixing, a product of Spanish tradition, American capitalism, and a multi-ethnic labor force. The long drive, the Chisholm Trail, and the end of the open range. The economic heart of the cattle kingdom was the long drive, a short-lived but legendary phenomenon that saw millions of cattle herded from the plains of Texas to the railheads hundreds of miles to the north. This era, lasting roughly from 1866 to 1890, was defined by a handful of great cattle trails, the most famous of which was the Chisholm Trail. Early drives in the 1840s and 50s had followed routes like the Shawnee Trail to Missouri, but these were often met with hostility from farmers who feared that the Texas Longhorns carried a disease known as Texas fever, which was fatal to their own domestic cattle. After the Civil War, the modern cattle drive era was truly born thanks to the ingenuity of an Illinois cattle buyer named Joseph G. McCoy. In 1867, he established a cattle shipping hub in Abilene, Kansas, a remote location on the Kansas Pacific Railroad, far from settled farmland. He built stockyards, hotels, and saloons, and advertised heavily in Texas, promising a safe and profitable market. His gamble paid off. Drovers began to forge a new route to Abilene, following a wagon road blazed by a Scotch-Cherokee trader named Jesse Chisholm. This route became known as the Chisholm Trail. Between 1867 and 1871 alone, more than 1.5 million Longhorns were driven up the Chisholm Trail to Abilene. As settlement pushed westward, the main route of the drives shifted to the Western Trail, which led to Dodge City, Kansas. Life on the trail was one of long periods of monotonous drudgery punctuated by moments of intense danger. A typical trail crew consisted of about a dozen men responsible for a herd of 2,500 to 3,000 cattle. The trail boss led the operation, the cook managed the chuck wagon, and the wrangler cared for the remuda, the string of spare horses. The cowboys rode in designated positions, point at the front of the herd, flank on the sides, and the dusty, undesirable drag at the rear. A day's work consisted of moving the herd 10 to 15 miles, allowing them to graze along the way. The greatest dangers were not gunfights, but stampedes, which could be triggered by a lightning strike or a careless noise, and treacherous river crossings, where both cattle and men could drown. The era of the open range and the long drive was surprisingly brief, brought to an end by a confluence of 3 powerful forces. First was the invention of barbed wire in 1874. This simple, cheap technology allowed farmers and ranchers to fence off the plains, enclosing water sources and blocking the great cattle trails. The fence-cutting wars that followed were a violent expression of the conflict between the old open-range model and the new reality of private property. Second was the weather. The plains were becoming overgrazed by millions of cattle, leaving little forage for the harsh winters. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was catastrophic. Blizzards and record-low temperatures swept across the northern plains, killing hundreds of thousands of cattle in an event that became known as the Big Die-Up. Many of the large cattle barons were bankrupted, and the industry was forced to adopt a more sustainable model of smaller, fenced-in ranches. Finally, the very technology that had created the long drive, the railroad, also ended it. As rail lines pushed further south and west, eventually reaching into Texas itself, the need for the long, dangerous, and expensive cattle drives to Kansas became obsolete. By 1890, the age of the open-range cowboy was over, passing from reality into American mythology. The gunfight, deconstructing the legends. No aspect of the Wild West has been more romanticized than the gunfight. Legends of heroic lawmen and vicious outlaws facing off on a dusty main street are central to the Western myth. The reality, however, was far more complex. The most famous conflicts of the era, like the gunfight at the OK Corral and the Lincoln County War, were not simple morality plays of good versus evil. They were messy, brutal struggles rooted in economic competition, political corruption, and personal animosities. The violence of the West was often a tool of economic transition, a way for rival factions to settle disputes over who would control the resources and power of a new territory. The gunfight at the OK Corral, which took place on October 26, 1881, is the most famous gunfight in American history. The popular version, immortalized in countless films, pits the heroic lawmen, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan Earp, along with their friend Doc Holliday, against the villainous Clanton and McClory brothers, members of a gang of outlaws known as the Cowboys. The historical truth is much murkier. First, the 30-second shootout did not happen at the OK Corral at all, but in a narrow vacant lot down the street. More importantly, it was the violent climax of a long-simmering feud between two distinct factions in Tombstone, Arizona. The Earps represented the town's business and Republican political interests, while the Clantons and McClorys were part of a loose network of rural ranchers and cowboys with Democratic sympathies, some of whom were involved in cattle rustling and smuggling. The conflict was as much about politics and economic control as it was about law and order. Wyatt Earp, far from being the central hero, was only a temporary deputy to his brother Virgil, the town marshal, and Wyatt himself had a checkered legal past that included arrests for horse theft and frequenting brothels. When the two groups finally confronted each other, it is still uncertain who fired first. The Earp faction claimed they were attempting to enforce a town ordinance against carrying firearms when the Cowboys drew on them. The surviving Cowboys claimed they were trying to surrender when the lawmen opened fire. The result was 3 dead Cowboys and 3 wounded lawmen, a bloody affair that divided the town and led to a cycle of revenge killings, including the assassination of Morgan Earp. An even more brutal and prolonged conflict was the Lincoln County War in New Mexico, 1878 to 1881. This was not a single gunfight but a full-blown economic and political war. On one side was the established monopoly, the House, run by Irish entrepreneurs Lawrence Murphy and James Dolan, who controlled the town's general store, had lucrative government contracts, and were allied with the local sheriff, William Brady. On the other side was a new faction led by an English rancher, John Tunstall, and a lawyer, Alexander McSween, who opened a rival store and bank, threatening the House's economic dominance. The war began in February 1878, when a posse allied with the House murdered John Tunstall in cold blood. In response, Tunstall's employees and allies formed a vigilante group called the Regulators to avenge his death. The most famous member of the Regulators was a young gunman named William H. Bonney, better known as Billy the Kid. The conflict devolved into a series of brutal revenge killings. The Regulators ambushed and killed Sheriff Brady on the main street of Lincoln. The war climaxed in July 1878 with the Battle of Lincoln, a 5-day siege and gunfight that engulfed the town and ended with the U.S. Army intervening, the burning of the McSween house, and the death of McSween himself. Billy the Kid escaped the inferno and lived as a fugitive until he was tracked down and killed by Sheriff Pat Garrett in 1881. The Lincoln County War was not a romantic tale of a heroic outlaw. It was a savage struggle for economic and political control, where both sides employed hired guns and committed atrocities in the name of profit and power. These real-world conflicts reveal that the Wild West was often less about justice and more about the violent, extra-legal resolution of economic disputes in a land where formal institutions of law were weak or corrupt. The other pioneers, untold stories. The traditional narrative of the West, focused on cowboys and gunslingers, has long marginalized the stories of the majority of people who live there. The West was built not just by men with guns, but by women who created communities, by African Americans who sought freedom from oppression, and by Chinese immigrants who provided the labor for one of the nation's greatest engineering feats. Their stories are essential to understanding the true complexity of the frontier experience. Women on the frontier faced immense challenges but also found unprecedented opportunities. Life was a litany of backbreaking labor. They were responsible for preparing their families for the dangerous westward journey and for maintaining a household in primitive conditions, often in crude log cabins or sod houses. They managed the home, tended gardens, raised children, and assisted with farm and ranch chores, their labor being integral to the survival of the family unit. Yet, the frontier also offered a degree of freedom and influence unknown in the more rigid society of the East. With men vastly outnumbering women, unmarried women found themselves in demand and could be more selective in choosing a partner, giving them a form of social capital. They took on vital economic roles, running boarding houses, laundries, and working as teachers and nurses. Their efforts in organizing churches and social groups were often the primary force in creating a sense of community in isolated towns. This vital role in building Western society earned them respect, and in a remarkable political development, Western territories were the first to grant women the right to vote. Wyoming led the way in 1869, decades before the 19th Amendment. African Americans also carved out new lives in the West, seeking an escape from the racial violence and crushing inequality of the Jim Crow South. After the failure of Reconstruction, a mass migration movement known as the Exodus of 1879 saw tens of thousands of Black Americans, called Exodusters, leave the Mississippi Delta for Kansas. Inspired by leaders like Benjamin "Pap" Singleton, who saw himself as a Black Moses, they sought a new promised land, where they could own land and exercise their rights as citizens. Kansas, the home state of abolitionist John Brown, held a powerful symbolic appeal. The reality was often harsh. Many arrived destitute and faced a new form of prejudice from white Kansans. Yet they persevered, establishing dozens of all-Black towns, the most famous of which was Nicodemus, Kansas. Another crucial chapter in the Black Western experience is the story of the Buffalo Soldiers. In 1866, Congress created the first all-Black peacetime Army regiments, the 9th and 10th Cavalry and the 24th and 25th Infantry. Stationed on the frontier, they were given their nickname by the Native American warriors they fought, who respected their ferocity and saw a resemblance between their dark, curly hair and a buffalo's coat. For over 2 decades, the Buffalo Soldiers served with distinction across the West. They protected settlers and mail routes, built roads and telegraph lines, and fought in numerous campaigns of the Indian Wars. They did all this while facing extreme racial prejudice from within the army, receiving inferior equipment and horses, and from the white civilians they were assigned to protect. In a unique contribution, they also served as the first national park rangers, protecting Yosemite and Sequoia National Parks from poachers and wildfires long before the National Park Service was created. The development of the West was also powered by the labor of Chinese immigrants. Lured by the gold rush, thousands crossed the Pacific to Gold Mountain. They were soon recruited to undertake the most difficult and dangerous work of building the western leg of the Transcontinental Railroad. From 1865 to 1869, as many as 15,000 Chinese laborers made up 90% of the Central Pacific Railroad's workforce. They were paid less than white workers and were tasked with the terrifying job of blasting and chipping tunnels through the solid granite of the Sierra Nevada mountains, where hundreds died in explosions, rock slides, and avalanches. After their monumental contribution was complete, a contribution symbolized by their conspicuous absence from the famous Golden Spike photograph at the railroad's completion, they faced a vicious wave of anti-Chinese sentiment. Scapegoated for economic downturns, they were subjected to mob violence and a series of discriminatory laws, culminating in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which banned all Chinese immigration and denied them the path to citizenship. The West, therefore, was not a simple land of freedom and opportunity. It was a place where the boundaries of American identity were being fiercely and often violently contested. For women, African Americans, and Chinese immigrants, it offered both the hope of a better life and the harsh reality of prejudice and exploitation. Part 5: The Last War for the West. The decades following the Civil War saw the final, tragic chapter in the centuries-long conflict between the expanding United States and the indigenous nations of the West. This was not a single, continuous war, but a series of brutal campaigns designed to break the power of the remaining free tribes, force them onto reservations, and clear the way for American settlement. This era was defined by a U.S. policy that amounted to total war, targeting not just warriors, but the very foundations of native life: their food, their shelter, their mobility, and their culture. This final conquest culminated in two of the most iconic and heartbreaking events in American history: the Battle of the Little Bighorn and the Wounded Knee Massacre, the Great Sioux War and Custer's Last Stand. By the 1870s, the Lakota Sioux and their Cheyenne and Arapaho allies were the last major obstacle to complete U.S. dominion over the northern Great Plains. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 had seemingly guaranteed them a vast reservation, including their sacred Black Hills, Paha Sapa. This peace was shattered in 1874 when an expedition led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, a flamboyant and ambitious Civil War hero, confirmed the presence of gold in the Black Hills. The announcement triggered a massive, illegal rush of white miners into the heart of the Great Sioux Reservation, a direct violation of the treaty. The U.S. government made a token effort to buy the Black Hills, but the Lakota, for whom the land was a spiritual center, refused to sell. In response, the government manufactured a pretext for war. In the winter of 1875, it issued an ultimatum: all Lakota and Cheyenne bands hunting in their treaty-guaranteed unceded territory must report to their reservation agencies by January 31, 1876, or be considered hostile. This was an impossible demand in the dead of winter, and it was intended to be. When the deadline passed, the matter was turned over to the Army. The Army launched a three-pronged campaign to converge on the hostile bands and force them back to the reservation. In June 1876, these bands, including thousands of warriors under the leadership of great war chiefs like Crazy Horse, and inspired by the spiritual power of the Hunkpapa Holy Man Sitting Bull, were gathered in a massive encampment on the banks of the Little Bighorn River in Montana. On June 25, Custer's 7th Cavalry, operating as the advance scout for one of the Army columns, discovered this village. Underestimating the size of the native force and eager for a glorious victory, Custer rashly decided to attack immediately. He compounded his error by dividing his regiment of about 600 men into 3 battalions. He sent one under Captain Frederick Benteen to scout to the south, another under Major Marcus Reno to charge the southern end of the village, and he led the largest contingent of 5 companies, about 210 men, to attack the northern end. Reno's attack was quickly repulsed by a swarm of warriors, and his panicked retreat across the river turned into a rout. Meanwhile, Custer and his command rode north along the bluffs, searching for a place to strike the village. They were met by an overwhelming force of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, perhaps as many as 3,000 strong. Surrounded, outmaneuvered, and vastly outnumbered, Custer's entire command was annihilated in a battle that lasted less than an hour. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was a stunning tactical victory for the Lakota and Cheyenne, one of the greatest defeats ever inflicted on the U.S. Army by a native force. But it was a strategic catastrophe. News of the Custer Massacre reached the East just as the nation was celebrating its centennial, sparking outrage and a cry for revenge. The narrative, shaped by the press, was one of a heroic soldier martyred by bloodthirsty savages, a story that galvanized public support for a massive military escalation. The Army flooded the plains with thousands of troops, who relentlessly pursued the scattered bands throughout the winter. They attacked villages, destroyed food supplies, and captured horse herds. By the end of 1877, exhausted and starving, most of the great leaders, including Crazy Horse, had been forced to surrender. Sitting Bull fled to Canada, but he too would eventually return and surrender in 1881. The victory at the Little Bighorn had sealed the fate of the Plains Indians. In its aftermath, the U.S. government illegally confiscated the Black Hills, breaking the 1868 treaty once and for all. A life in squares, the reservation system. With the end of the Indian Wars, the U.S. government's policy of removal and conquest shifted to one of confinement and assimilation. The reservation system was the primary instrument of this new policy, a system designed to concentrate native peoples on small, isolated tracts of land where they could be controlled, civilized, and ultimately erased as distinct cultural and political entities. The stated purpose of the reservations was twofold: to clear vast territories for white settlement and to transform Native Americans from nomadic hunters or communal horticulturalists into individualistic, Christian, yeoman farmers in the American mold. Life on these reservations was a disaster. The lands allotted were often the poorest and least suitable for agriculture. The government, which had promised to provide food, clothing, and other supplies in exchange for the ceded lands, consistently failed to meet its obligations due to corruption and incompetence. This left many tribes dependent on inadequate government rations and perpetually on the brink of starvation. The system destroyed traditional economies, banned religious ceremonies, and undermined traditional forms of government. Tribal members were policed by federal Indian agents who held immense power over their lives, and laws like the Major Crimes Act of 1885 stripped tribes of their legal sovereignty, placing them under the jurisdiction of federal courts. The cornerstone of this assimilation policy was the General Allotment Act of 1887, also known as the Dawes Act. The act sought to destroy the tribal unit by breaking up communally owned reservation lands. It divided the land into 160-acre individual plots, which were allotted to the heads of families. The goal was to instill the concept of private property and force Native Americans to become individual farmers. Any land left over after allotment, the so-called surplus land, was opened up to white settlement. The policy was a catastrophic failure for Native peoples. Over the next few decades, it resulted in the loss of nearly 90 million acres of tribal land, two-thirds of the land base they held in 1887. The most brutal tool of forced assimilation was the off-reservation boarding school system. Beginning with the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania, founded in 1879 by Richard Henry Pratt, the system was built on the infamous motto, "Kill the Indian and save the man." Native children were forcibly taken from their families and sent to these militaristic schools hundreds or even thousands of miles from home. There, they were stripped of their identities. Their hair was cut, their traditional clothes were replaced with uniforms, and they were forbidden to speak their own languages or practice their own religions, often under threat of harsh physical punishment. The schools were plagued by disease, malnutrition, and abuse. While the goal was to prepare them for life in white society, most graduates found themselves caught between two worlds, unable to fully return to their own cultures but not fully accepted by the dominant one. The reservation system, through land allotment and forced education, was a systematic assault on Native American culture, sovereignty, and identity. The Ghost Dance and the Tragedy at Wounded Knee. By 1890, the situation for the Lakota on their shrunken reservations was desperate. Their rations had been cut by Congress, drought had ruined their crops, and disease was rampant. They were a people on the brink of starvation, their culture under assault and their way of life destroyed. It was in this climate of despair that a new spiritual movement offered a glimmer of hope, the Ghost Dance. The movement originated with a Paiute prophet named Wovoka, who preached that if Native peoples lived righteously and performed a ritual circle dance, the Great Spirit would restore the world to its former state. The buffalo would return, the white settlers would disappear, and their deceased ancestors would come back to life. It was a peaceful, messianic vision of renewal, not a call to war. The Ghost Dance spread rapidly across the desperate reservations of the West. The Lakota, in particular, embraced it with fervor, adding their own element, sacred ghost shirts, that they believed would protect them from the soldiers' bullets. The U.S. authorities on the reservations, ignorant of the religion's peaceful nature, viewed the Ghost Dance with alarm, seeing it as a precursor to a massive uprising. The agent at the Pine Ridge Reservation, Daniel F. Royer, panically called for troops, and the army was sent in to suppress the movement. Tensions escalated dramatically on December 15, 1890, when agency police, sent to arrest Sitting Bull for his perceived role in promoting the dance, killed the great Hunkpapa leader in a chaotic scuffle. Sitting Bull's death sent a wave of terror through the Ghost Dancers. A band of Minneconjou Lakota, led by Chief Satanka or Bigfoot, who was himself ill with pneumonia, fled their reservation, seeking refuge with Chief Red Cloud at Pine Ridge, who they hoped could mediate a peaceful solution. On December 28th, they were intercepted by the 7th Cavalry, Custer's Old Regiment, and escorted to a camp on Wounded Knee Creek. The next morning, December 29, 1890, the commander, Colonel James Forsyth, surrounded the Lakota camp with his soldiers and 4 rapid-fire Hotchkiss guns positioned on a nearby hill. He ordered the Lakota, who were mostly women and children, to surrender their weapons. As the soldiers searched the men, a deaf Lakota named Black Coyote resisted giving up his rifle. In the struggle, the gun went off. The single shot triggered an instantaneous and indiscriminate volley from the soldiers. They fired their carbines into the crowd of mostly unarmed men, and then turned their Hotchkiss guns on the women and children fleeing into a nearby ravine. The firing continued until almost no one was left moving. When it was over, at least 150, and perhaps as many as 300, Lakota lay dead or dying in the snow, including Chief Bigfoot. 25 soldiers were also killed, many of them victims of their own comrades' crossfire. The Wounded Knee Massacre was the final, bloody punctuation mark on the Indian Wars. It broke the last organized resistance to reservation life and became a searing symbol of the brutality and injustice of the American conquest of the West. In 1890, the same year as the massacre, the U.S. Census Bureau declared that there was no longer a continuous frontier line. The West, as a process of expansion, was over. The land had been won. The closed frontier, Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis. In 1893, at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, a grand celebration of American progress and industry, a young Wisconsin historian named Frederick Jackson Turner presented an academic paper that would become one of the most influential essays in American history, The Significance of the Frontier in American History. Quoting the 1890 census report, Turner announced that the frontier had gone, and with its going, has closed the first period of American history. He then laid out his famous frontier thesis. He argued that the unique character of the United States was not inherited from Europe, but was forged in the crucible of the frontier. The process of moving westward, of winning a wilderness, had stripped away the layers of European civilization and forced settlers to become resourceful, self-reliant, and individualistic. This perennial rebirth, he argued, was the source of American democracy, innovation, and national identity. The frontier was the line of most rapid and effective Americanization, transforming the European into a new man, the American. Turner's thesis was immensely powerful and influential, providing a compelling, heroic narrative for American history. It was also deeply flawed. His vision of the frontier was an almost exclusively white male story. He paid no attention to the experiences of women, African Americans, Hispanic peoples, or Asian immigrants. He viewed Native Americans not as people with their own societies and histories, but as part of the wild nature that had to be overcome, a catalyst for the development of the rugged American character. His thesis presented the settlement of the West as a triumphant, progressive process, largely ignoring the immense violence, dispossession, and exploitation that made it possible. Despite its flaws, Turner's thesis provided the intellectual framework for the myth of the West, defining the frontier as the wellspring of American virtue and exceptionalism. Buffalo Bill's extravaganza, the Wild West as entertainment. While Turner was intellectualizing the West for an academic audience, another man was commercializing and mythologizing it for a global one. William F. Buffalo Bill Cody was a genuine frontier figure, a Pony Express rider, Army Scout, and buffalo hunter. In 1883, he channeled his real-life adventures into a new form of entertainment, Buffalo Bill's Wild West, a massive outdoor spectacle that would turn the history of the West into a global sensation. Cody's production was not a play. He insisted it was a realistic depiction of frontier life. It featured a huge cast of real cowboys, sharpshooters like the famous Annie Oakley, and, crucially, a large contingent of Real Lakota Indians, including, for a time, the Great Sitting Bull himself. The show was a series of thrilling vignettes: a buffalo hunt with a live herd, an attack on the Deadwood stagecoach, a reenactment of a train robbery, and the grand finale, a dramatic, settler-centric version of the Battle of the Little Bighorn, where Custer's defeat was avenged by the heroic arrival of Buffalo Bill. The show was a phenomenon. It toured the United States and Europe, performing for Queen Victoria, the Pope, and royalty from across the continent. At the same 1893 Chicago World's Fair where Turner presented his thesis, Buffalo Bill's Wild West performed just outside the fairgrounds to sold-out crowds, cementing its place in the popular imagination. The impact of the show was enormous. For millions of people in the urbanized East and in Europe, Buffalo Bill's show was the American West. It presented a simplified, romantic, and morally unambiguous narrative of heroic cowboys triumphing over savage Indians. It froze the image of the Plains Indian in time, forever associating them with feathered headdresses and warfare, while ignoring the reality of their forced assimilation on reservations. It created the cowboy as a global icon of American masculinity and freedom. Buffalo Bill's Wild West took the complex, messy history of the frontier and turned it into a thrilling, nostalgic, and highly profitable entertainment, creating the enduring mythology that Hollywood would later inherit and amplify. The echo of a gunshot, legacy of the real and imagined West. The timing of this myth-making was not a coincidence. America began to romanticize and memorialize the frontier precisely at the moment it was conquered and closed. The myth became a substitute for the reality, a nostalgic story that served a vital national purpose. In an era of massive industrialization, labor unrest, and a flood of new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, the story of the West provided a unifying national epic. It offered a vision of a shared, heroic past rooted in the land, one that papered over the brutal realities of conquest and the deep divisions of the Civil War. The myth of the rugged individualist conquering a continent provided a powerful narrative for a nation stepping onto the world stage as a new global power. This myth, perpetuated in dime novels, Wild West shows, and later, thousands of films and television shows, became one of America's most powerful cultural exports. It is a story of freedom, opportunity, and self-reliance that continues to resonate deeply within the American psyche. But the legacy of the real West is far more complicated, and it is just as present. It lives on in the ongoing struggles of native nations for sovereignty and the preservation of their cultures. It lives on in the enduring Hispanic heritage of the Southwest. It lives on in the communities built by the descendants of Black exodusters and Buffalo Soldiers, and in the contributions of the families of Chinese railroad workers. The history of the American West is not a simple story of progress and triumph. It is a profoundly human story of conquest and survival, of breathtaking violence and resilient community building, of heartbreaking loss and incredible endurance. It is the story of how a continent was transformed and how a nation in the process defined itself, both by what it chose to remember and by what it chose to forget.